Sports are history.
Welcome into Why the Vikings Are Cursed Part 2. The Hursening. The Hursening. Well, which doesn't make sense yet. That will make sense. Anyways, if you didn't join us for Part 1, why are you watching this? Who am I kidding? Nobody's watching this. So, where we left off, we were pulling on a Cowboys thread, and do keep that in mind. We will get there, but first, let's talk about where people think maybe another Vikings curse came from, right? A lot of people believe that the Vikings leaving their old outdoor Metropolitan Stadium and moving into the warmer indoors of the Metrodome curse them. They think that, giving up that home field advantage that they got in the bitter cold winter months for the warm indoors, why they haven't made it back to a Super Bowl. The Vikings moved into the Metrodome in 82, and, they stopped making Super Bowls. The last one was in 76, so it doesn't really time up that well. Plus, they won their first 2 playoff games in the Metrodome, and including the very first year the Metrodome was open. They won a playoff game there. They've got a 6-5 record in the playoffs in the Metrodome, so it's not really enough for a curse, Stadiums, they get old, they fall apart, teams got to move. Unfortunately, the Metrodome quite literally did fall apart, yes, but that doesn't mean it's cursed, it's not like the Vikings were in the building when the roof collapsed. So unless it's a historic stadium like Lambeau or Wrigley, I just don't think it's enough for a curse. And curses are really earned, and man, the Vikings, they would earn theirs again. In 1987, the Vikings would go on a Cinderella run. They would make the playoffs after missing it for 4 years prior to that, which is still their longest playoff drought since they first made the playoffs in 1968. Anyways, they would make the playoffs as a wild card team, and despite being heavy underdogs in all of their games, they would handedly win their first 2 playoff games and make it to the NFC Championship game, which, they lost. And despite there being a heartbreaking play in that game, it was really anything but heartbreaking. The Vikings shouldn't have even made it that far. It was a great season and showed that the Vikings really had something to build on for the future. And the next season seemed to back that up. They would win 3 more games in the regular season than they did in the previous season. They'd be back in the playoffs. They had the best defense in the league that year. They held opposing QBs to a 41.2 passer rating, which wasn't just the best for that season, it was best for the entire decade of the 80s. They would lose in their second playoff game. They won their first one. They would lose their second one against the 49ers and eventual Super Bowl champs, just like they did the year before, lose to the eventual Super Bowl champions. They just did it a game earlier this season, but despite that, it really seemed like they were building on something here. Next year, however, their GM Mike Lynn felt that they weren't building quite fast enough and thought that what his team really needed to get over the hump and make it back to the Super Bowl was an all-star player for their offense. In October of '89, the Cowboys would put up their best player at the time, running back Herschel Walker, on the trade block. And the Vikings GM, being afraid to be outbid by the Browns, another team known for spectacular trades, he would essentially trade 5 players and 8 draft picks for Herschel Walker. He would give up the Vikings' first, second, and 6th round draft picks for the very next year in 1990, along with 5 players who were all tied to conditional draft picks. Very high draft picks. Here's the breakdown for you. The players and draft picks that they were tied to are linebacker Jesse Solomon, the Vikings' leading tackler the previous 2 seasons, who would be tied to their first-round draft pick in 91. Then linebacker David Howard, who was also a starting linebacker for them, and would be tied to their second-round draft pick for 91. Next, there's cornerback Isaac Holt, also a starter for them and tied to their first-round draft pick in 92. Then running back Darren Nelson, tied to their second-round draft pick in 92. And finally, rookie defensive end Alex Stewart, tied to their 3rd round pick in 92. Now, GM Mike Lynn didn't think that the Cowboys would trade away all of these players, seeing as these players were all better than the ones that the Cowboys had at the time. But their coach, Jimmy Johnson, he was not interested in these players at all. He just wanted the draft picks, and before the end of that season, he traded away all 5 of those players to get the draft picks they were tied to. Meaning that the Cowboys now had the Vikings' first 2 draft picks for the 90 and 91 draft, and their first 3 draft picks for their 92 draft. And by that 92 draft, when the Cowboys controlled the Vikings' first 3 draft picks the Vikings had given up for running back Herschel Walker, well, the Vikings no longer had Herschel Walker. They cut him after the 91 season, and he, never got 1,000 rushing yards for them. They did make the playoffs the first year that they had him, or I guess first half a season. They had him in 89, but they didn't win a playoff game, and the next 2 seasons they missed the playoffs completely, while the Cowboys, of course, used those draft picks to build their dynasty. So the trade, I guess it didn't instantly wreck the Vikings, seeing as they still made the playoffs that season, but it changed the entire atmosphere of the locker room. Many of the players felt that the organization saw this one player, Herschel Walker, as more important as, the organization itself, seeing as they traded away 5 pretty dang good players. I mean, you're talking 3 defensive starters and really high draft picks.
It's not only awful from the Vikings standpoint because they traded away all these pieces that helped them get to an NFC Championship game just 2 years before.
His talents did not translate in any way, shape, or form to what the Vikings were doing.
Their GM had taken what was the best defense in the league and completely gutted it. The next season in 1990, they would drop from 1st to 13th in the league in defense. Now, while in hindsight, the Herschel Walker trade seems like an obviously terrible one, back then there were plenty of people who thought that it was the Vikings that won the trade and that the Cowboys got fleeced.
I couldn't understand it at the time, and I'm glad they viewed it differently because that certainly, got us over the hump in a hurry.
We've got the great Herschel Walker.
Walker at the goal line!
And then all of a sudden they announce that they're going to trade him?
A radio friend of mine says the Dallas Cowboys have just traded a Rolls Royce for 5 Toyotas.
Again, anything that seems like it should be great for the Vikings just bites them in the ass. On the precipice of building something great, the Vikings would stab themselves in the back, much like they did the AFL. And this time, it would help a rival NFC team get what the Vikings had missed out on. 3 Super Bowl championships in 4 years. And it wasn't just any rival NFC team, but the one created alongside the Vikings solely to compete with the AFL. The Vikings AFL or AFC Super Bowl curse would now turn into an NFC playoff curse. And not one where they would lose in the playoffs in blowout fashion, but in utter heartbreaking fashion. Although they have been blown out in the playoffs some since then, including twice in NFC championship games. But hey, whose team doesn't get blown out in the postseason every now and again? It happens to the best of them, right? Yeah. Now, the Vikings did make it back to the playoffs in 92, but lost their only playoff game. In fact, they lost their first 4 playoff games after the Herschel Walker trade. Yeah. Now, we must get to the first time we see the second Vikings curse. And I'm sorry, Vikings fans, it is the 1998 Minnesota Vikings. Yes, they had the best offense the league had ever seen up to that point. They put up a record 556 points, as well as having the Rookie of the Year that year, right, in Randy Moss, and the best kicker the league had ever seen, at least for a single season. Yes, it was, close your eyes and ears, Vikings fans, Gary Anderson. Gary Anderson would be the first kicker not to miss a single kick or extra point in the regular season. In fact, he didn't miss a kick in the playoffs either until John Madden, the coach of the team that beat the Vikings in their last Super Bowl, right? The last time we saw their first curse, would now give the Vikings an all-time announcer's curse to bring about the first time we see their second curse.
So that's a pretty good bet if you say, do you think Gary Anderson will make this field goal? The answer should probably be yes.
39 yards away, and it's not good.
Yeah, there were 2 minutes and 11 seconds left in the game when he missed that field goal. Had he made it, the Vikings would have been up 10, and it essentially would have ended the game. But instead he missed, and the Falcons marched down the field and scored a touchdown in the final 2 minutes. The Vikings would actually get the ball first in overtime. In fact, they got the ball twice in overtime, and this was when overtime was sudden death. You would think that the best offense the league had ever seen could get you into field goal range with 2 opportunities. But they couldn't. The Vikings had the best offense and kicker the league's ever seen. All just to make it that much more heartbreaking when both of those failed them when they needed them the most.
My dad, who I'd never seen cry my whole life, wiped away a tear. He said, "A little part of me just died, son."
The next cursed moment for the Vikings comes in 2003, when all the Vikings needed to do to win the division and make the playoffs was to beat a god-awful Cardinals team in the last game of the year. A Cardinals team that only had 3 wins going into that game, and it seemed like the Vikings would do just that. They had an 11-point lead with 6:48 left to go in the game, but somehow the Cardinals would find themselves with a chance to win the game. After closing the gap to 17-12, the Cardinals would have a second and goal opportunity from the 9-yard line with 40 seconds left and 1 timeout. But then the Cardinals would take a sack and use their last timeout, giving them 3rd and goal from the 14. But it gets much worse for them. On 3rd and 14, they would again get sacked and lose another 14 yards, and now time was quickly winding down. Their offense had to rush back to the line of scrimmage and, well,
here it is! The season's on the line! 2 receivers left and right. McCown takes the snap. He steps up. He's all by himself. Fires into the end zone. Caught! Touchdown! No! No! The Cardinals have knocked the Vikings out of the playoffs. They're Minnesota Vikings crying on the field.
The Vikings got back-to-back sacks to lose their opponent a combined 19 yards and set them up with a 4th and 28 with time quickly winding down. It seemed so great for the Vikings, but anything that should be good for them, so heartbreaking. Sure, it wasn't technically a playoff game that they lost, but it had the same stakes. You win and you move on to the next week, you lose and you go home. And losing that game not only cost the Vikings the playoffs, it handed the division to the Green Bay Packers. The Vikings lost by giving up 2 touchdowns in the 4th quarter that each came on 4th down to give the Cardinals their 4 wins on the season. When's the next wonderful time we would see this curse? Well, it's in 2009. Yes, the NFC Championship game against the Saints, or the Bountygate game. I'm sorry, Vikings fans, this is all just heartbreaking. I don't know why you're watching it. You probably aren't. That year, the Vikings had acquired a Hall of Fame quarterback who wore the number 4. Brett Favre. And in that game, they would score 4 touchdowns, but ultimately lose when number 4 would throw an interception on the last drive of the game, when the game was tied up and the Vikings were just inside field goal range. He did not need to make that throw. Their Hall of Fame running back Adrian Peterson would also fumble a handoff when they are at the Saints' 4-yard line. They would lose that game in overtime ultimately, but that interception was really what lost it for them. Now, their offense did turn the ball over 5 times, but 3 of those times came from their Hall of Fame quarterback and running back, and both of them turned the ball over in very crucial moments of that game. I mean, having a Hall of Fame running back and quarterback, that should be so great for Vikings fans, but
you broke my heart. You broke my heart.
All right, when was their next cursed moment? 2015. 2017. And this one would be kind of a mashup of their 1998 and 2009 Heartbreak. Yeah, in 2015, the Vikings would once again have the best kicker in the league. This time, it was Blair Walsh who led the league and made field goals. Going into the fourth quarter of this game, the Vikings led 9-0 off 3 made field goals from Blair Walsh. Then, Seattle would score a touchdown to make it 9-7, after which the Vikings Hall of Fame running back and best running back in history of their franchise, Adrian Peterson, would fumble. Yeah. Seattle would recover the ball and get a field goal off the turnover to put them up 10-9. But the Vikings would have a great chance to win this game. Their offense would get the ball with under 2 minutes left and were able to get the ball all the way down to Seattle's 9-yard line with 26 seconds left and Seattle having no timeouts. They set up their kicker for what was basically a chip shot field goal to win. 2 of the field goals Blair Walsh had made that day were from over 40 yards out, so you would think a 27-yard field goal would be nothing for him or any NFL caliber kicker. But he would line up for his 4th kick of the game and not be so lucky. And I say luck because it wasn't all Blair Walsh's fault. No, the laces were in. Yes, he was Ray Finkled.
The laces were in! They were in!
The best kicker in the league that year and the best running back in the history of your franchise. Should have been so good, and yet
I'm heartbroken.
Do I really need to keep going? Fine, I will. But first, let's take a look at some historic moments that actually went the Vikings' way and were not heartbreaking for them. Like in 2017 with the Minneapolis Miracle.
Keenum steps into it. Pass is caught! Diggs! Sideline! Touchdown! Unbelievable! Vikings win it!
Diggs, sideline, touchdown! The only good call of Joe Buck's career. So, there are 2 miracles that day. And then in 2022, when the Vikings would pull off the biggest comeback in NFL history against the Colts when they were down 33-0 at half. 2022 would also bring about the next time we see their curse, however. See, the Vikings were 13-4 that year, but a lot of people doubted their record. They had won 11 of their games by 1 score and were the first team with 12 or more wins to have a negative point differential at -3. All 4 of the games they lost that year were by at least 11 points. And the haters' doubts would ultimately be proven right. In the playoffs, the Vikings would find themselves facing the Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley-led Giants, and it would all come down to the last drive of the game for the Vikings. In the last 2 minutes of the game, the Vikings would be at midfield with the ball, but find themselves at 4th and 8. So what did their quarterback, Kurt Cole's Cash Cousins, do? He threw it for 3 yards to their tight end, who was immediately tackled. The Vikings, who hadn't lost a 1-score game all year, in fact, winning 11 of those games, would lose their only 1-score game of the year in the playoffs. Winning 11 games by 1 score, quite the impressive feat, but just led to more heartbreak. Like in 2024, when the Vikings would again have an impressive feat involving their record. They would have a 14-win season that year. It was the 2nd most in their franchise's history. And yet, they would be the least successful 14-win team of all time. They were the only 14-win team not to win their division or make it past the wildcard round of the playoffs. I mean, it's the 2nd most win of your franchise's history. Yes, I know there were 17 games now since the 2021 season, so a little easier to get to 14 wins, but still, very impressive feat, and
You're breaking my heart.
Since the Herschel Walker trade, the Vikings have had some great teams, but they almost always end in historic heartbreak. Their 15-win team in '98 was the first 15-win team not to make a Super Bowl. Their 14-win team, as we just discussed, was the least successful 14-win team of all time, and their 13-win team in 2022 was the worst 13-win team of all time, seeing as they didn't win a single playoff game and had a negative point differential. The only 12-win team they've had since the Herschel Walker trade was their 2009 Bountygate team. And one of the 11-win teams they've had was in 2000 when they lost the most lopsided NFC championship game of all time to the Giants, the old 41-donut game that we didn't even mention. I've laid out a lot of claims in these two videos, but I think I've supplied enough evidence. However, if there's only one thing you take away from this video, it should be that the Vikings are cursed to be the most heartbreaking team of all time. And it's heartbreak that usually comes from something that should be great for the Vikings and just stabs them in the back in the end. Vikings are not the worst or the saddest team of all time. That would probably be the Browns or Lions. No, the Vikings are the most heartbreaking team of all time. They have given their fans so much hope just to break their hearts more than any other team in the NFL. And to close out this video, I will supply some stats to back up that claim. Since the 1970 merger, the Vikings are third all-time in playoff appearances. The top 5 teams in playoff appearances since the merger are the Steelers, the Cowboys, the Vikings, the 49ers, and the Patriots. And what do all those teams have in common that the Vikings don't? Well, it's not just a Super Bowl win.
Not 2, not 3, not 4.
No, it is at least 5 Super Bowl wins and a dynasty to their name. This also means that the Vikings have the most postseason losses since the merger. In fact, the top 10 teams in postseason losses, well, they all have multiple Super Bowl wins, except the Vikings, who are all the way at the top at number 1. But if you want to forget the merger and just go all-time, yes, all-time postseason losses, well, you still have the Vikings at number 1. And you don't get to another team without multiple Super Bowl wins until you have the Bills and Titans, who are tied at 11. Now, admittedly, the Bills may have more peak heartbreak than the Vikings, seeing as they lost all their 4 Super Bowls in a row, but they don't have the quantity of heartbreak that the Vikings have. Although they are working on it. The Bills do also have the most postseason wins without a Super Bowl win, but it's only 1 more than the Vikings, and they just got that last season. Somehow, the Vikings have the most postseason losses of all time, and there are some teams who are decades older than them, including the 3 other teams in their division. In fact, those 3 other teams are older than the postseason itself, and yet don't have the amount of postseason losses the Vikings do. So the next time you're watching the Vikings in the postseason, you gotta cheer for them. Cheer for their curse to finally be broken. Cheer for their fan base who has had their hearts broken more than any other team in the NFL. Cheer for that purple and gold to finally win a Super Bowl. A game that was given its name by the founder of the league they stabbed in the back. A game that's trophy is named after the coach of their greatest rival, the Green Bay Packers. Packers who have 4 Super Bowls themselves. Same as the team who first beat the Vikings in a Super Bowl and whose founder they stabbed in the back, or the league that they stabbed in the back. You know what I'm saying.
1, 2, 3, 4.
But hey, if you think I got anything wrong, or that this whole thing's bullshit, or maybe I missed something, if they're cursed, well, please let me know about it in the comments. Maybe even give me a good old like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, thanks, bye.